Having lingered over Giotto and the Proto-Renaissance, I'm going to race through early Renaissance architecture. The Khan Academy podcast describe our two required works very well, and I'm not going to repeat all those points. Instead, I want to show you other works by the same architects and talk more generally about Italian Renaissance architecture. So don't skip your homework podcasts, okay? Here, with some modern additions, of course, is the skyline of the early Italian Renaissance. On the right, circled in green, you see Florence Cathedral, the Duomo, an Italian Gothic structure with a campanile or bell tower designed by Giotto, circled in blue or purple, and Brunelleschi's famous Renaissance dome. Further to your left, and circled in red, is the tower of the Palazzo della Signoria. The Signoria were the ruling body of Florence. It's the town hall. Although they are now in museums, Donatello's David, Michelangelo's David, and Donatello's Judith all at some point stood in the piazza or square in front of this building, symbolizing Florence's fight against more powerful neighbors. So here's a closer look at the Palazzo Vecchio, which is how the Palazzo della Signoria is now known. It's basically a fortified building, and there's a reason for that. The rulers needed protection against Florence's own citizens. There was a major workers' uprising in Florence in the 14th century, about a century before the works we're looking at. And after that, many other internal struggles that you learned about in the Medici video if you watched it. At this point in our history, Florence is a republic run by merchant oligarchs and increasingly by the Medici family. You will recall, I hope, that Brunelleschi lost the famous competition to sculpt and cast the baptistry doors. That project kept Alberti busy for the next 20 years. But Brunelleschi, after sulking for a while, went off to Rome to study Roman buildings. Upon his return, he began to design classically inspired buildings, such as our required work, the Pazzi Chapel on the bottom, and this hospital, really an orphanage for abandoned children, which is pictured on top. That the city commissioned such a work and wanted it to be beautiful says something important about Florentine civic culture. The hospital is not a required work, but it's similar enough to the Pazzi Chapel that I could see it showing up in an attribution question. So, what similarities do you see between these two buildings, both designed by Brunelleschi? Well, the design of both buildings is dominated by the Roman arch and based on two geometrical figures, the cube and the circle, really a hemisphere or half sphere. If you remember the terms simplicity, symmetry, and geometry, you can describe almost any Renaissance building in an art history essay. The building also includes terracotta roundels or tondos. Both words are used, between the arches. Those are those round figures. They are actually terracotta sculptures produced by the famous Della Robbia family, which had discovered new glazing techniques and created a terracotta sculpture empire that continues to this day. This chapel, which is a required work, was donated by the wealthy Pazzi family to the Franciscan Church of Santa Croce in Florence. It originally served as the chapter house or meeting room for the Franciscan friars. Again, we see the geometrical elements, semicircles, cubes, and rectangles. And here's a closer view of the roundels or tondos. Note the four evangelists and the pendentives. By now you should recognize their symbols. And below them we see apostles. The one on the right, who could that be? Well, catch the keys, it's surely St. Peter. Luca della Robbia sculpted the evangelists, but the apostles have been attributed to della Robbia, to Brunelleschi himself, and even to Donatello. We just don't know for sure. The Pazzi Chapel was designed on the simple central plan that Brunelleschi so admired in the Pantheon. Here you see the Brunelleschi plan and the loggia that was later added to the plan, but is a typical feature of Renaissance architecture and a term you need to know. Again, note how the design employs pietra serena stone to set off the walls and to highlight the building's geometric design and regularity. We also see an oculus in the dome, another shout out to Roman architecture. By the way, art historians now think that Brunelleschi drew up the initial plan, but died before the building's execution and detailing, and he did not design the second floor. So we've already learned about Brunelleschi's famous dome, the most noted work of Renaissance architecture, but mysteriously absent from the list. And here is the interior of Santo Spirito, also designed by Brunelleschi. Note again the rhythmic simplicity, the use of arches and Corinthian columns, the contrast between plaster and pietra serena, and the use of roundels as a decorative accent. And once again, Brunelleschi shows off his mathematical skills. The nave is exactly twice as high as it is wide. This extreme geometric regularity made his buildings both highly rhythmic and serene, and these again are trademarks of Renaissance architecture. Renaissance Florentine architects also specialized in residential architecture. No surprise when you consider that their patrons were mostly wealthy merchants. So what classical elements do you perceive in this work? The photo on the right should be a pretty broad hint. Alberti deliberately echoed the ascending orders of the Colosseum. Tuscan, a form of Doric with a base, followed by Ionic and then Corinthian. In the place of rounded columns, however, he used pilasters or flat engaged columns. You may also have noted the arch-topped windows and the massive cornice. The effect is a screen-like grid, highly controlled, mathematical, and proportional. Alberti not only designed buildings, he wrote books about painting, sculpture, and architecture, and in fact is one of our best guides to the art of the Renaissance. But I should note that some art historians challenge the attribution to Alberti. The College Board apparently does not. Here's another famous Renaissance palace, not a required work. Note the similarities to the palazzo you just saw. Cosimo de' Medici wanted elegance without ostentation. Note the rusticated or rough-edged brick, which is a common Roman feature. The internal courtyard looks a lot like Brunelleschi's interiors, simple, geometric, and organized around the arch. On to early Renaissance sculpture and painting.